Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the sixth iteration of our Tech Talks webinar series. If you've missed our previous webinars, you can find the recordings for those on our YouTube channel. Before we get rolling, we have a few housekeeping items to highlight. At the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A window. If you have a question you'd like our presenter to discuss, please make sure to submit it there. You can also use this window to contact our behind-the-scenes team if you're experiencing technical difficulties or if you have a more general question. Lastly, a recording of this webinar will also be available later this afternoon on our YouTube channel. Without further ado, we'll introduce our moderator for today, Kanavis Smith. He is the manager for the Professional Masters in Engineering program at Texas Engineering Executive Education, which is the continuing and professional education unit of the Cockrell School of Engineering at UT Austin. Take it away, Kanavis.
Thank you so much, Javier. As Javier mentioned, my name is Kanavis Smith, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Eric Bickel. Eric Bickel is a professor and the director of both the Operations Research and Industrial Engineering and the Engineering Management programs at the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include the theory and practice of decision analysis, which is decision making under uncertainty, and its application to business, policy, and sports. His work has addressed the modeling of probabilistic dependence, value of information, scoring rules, calibration, risk preference, decision education, decision making in sports, and climate engineering as a response to climate change. His work on climate engineering was selected by a panel of Nobel laureates in economics as the best approach to climate change. So as you can see, his research speaks for itself, even with his peers. He holds a MS and a PhD from the Department of Engineering Economic Systems at Stanford University. Also, Professor Bickel is a director at Strategic Decisions Group. He has consulted around the world in a range of industries, including oil and gas, electricity generation, energy trading and marketing, commodity and special chemicals, life sciences, and the list goes on. So please help me welcome, without further ado, Professor Eric Bickel.
All right, Kanavis, thank you, and good morning. You can hear me okay? Everything's good, okay. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got the title page up, and presume you can see that, and if you have any trouble, you can ping Kanavis and Javier. I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to join us, and what I'd like to talk about this morning is forecasting around COVID-19. And really, my primary interest is what we can learn about modeling in general by looking at the different forecasts, the structure of those models, and how they performed. This is joint work with one of my PhD students, Colin Small. First, let me just, one slide here on the engineering management program itself. As Kanavis mentioned, I'm the director of this program. Of course, this program's housed within the highly ranked Cockrell School of Engineering. We offer a professional master's degree in engineering management. The courses meet one weekend a month, and they're offered in person and synchronously online. Currently, everything's being offered via Zoom. And the faculty are drawn from engineering, business, and law. And if you look at just the ranking of the College of Engineering and College of Business here at UT, average those, our engineering management program is the highest ranked public engineering management program. And there's courses in a variety of topics, which you can see here. My focus is on decision and risk analysis. So turn to the topic. I want to give you a brief introduction, just the motivation for the talk, and then I'll describe a model that I created back in March, which I call a naive model because it's very simple. And then we'll discuss some other models and then look at the accuracy of the different approaches, and then finally wrap up. We'll take questions at the end. I'll try to make sure we leave 15 minutes or so for questions. So my goals for this talk, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm primarily interested in what can we learn about modeling. I'm interested in modeling in general. I work on usually major decision problems, and these tend to be relatively unique decisions and involve some type of modeling. And I got interested in just watching the forecasts and thinking about, well, what does this mean in terms of the different approaches that teams are taking? While the forecasts are important, it's not my aim to claim that we have any special skill, Colin or myself, when it comes to forecasting COVID-19 cases and deaths. In fact, the model I'm going to present is very simple, almost embarrassingly simple. And it could really serve, I think, as a forecasting benchmark in that more sophisticated models you would think would be more accurate. Okay. Colin and I, we've done our best to analyze the accuracy of different models. We've selected a few to illustrate different modeling approaches. We haven't tried to analyze the accuracy of all the different models that are out there. There's quite a few, as you'll see. And of course, if we've made any mistakes in our analysis, we're happy to correct that. Currently, there's over 30 different groups or organizations that are forecasting COVID-19, either cases or deaths. And this is just a screenshot from the CDC. The top graph, we have new weekly deaths. These are the different groups that are forecasting. And then to the right, you can see the range of their forecasts, and some of them include a probability interval around those forecasts. And then to the right, the CDC has the actuals, and then they're producing what they call an ensemble forecast. They're taking an average of these models in some way, some type of a weighted average, which is this red line. And then the gray lines would be the presumably mean forecasts of the different models. So they're trying to average across the work of many different groups. And then down below here is total deaths, cumulative deaths, and then the forecasts for that, and then the ensemble. As of August 22nd, which is when we tried to lock down some of the data for the analysis here, the national ensemble from CDC was predicting for the week ending September 12th, there'd be between 187,000 and 205,000 total, that'd be cumulative deaths. So that would be kind of the latest, maybe consensus or average forecast. A lot of different groups, and they have different approaches. There's been a lot of discussion, if you were following this early on, around the difficulty of modeling COVID-19 and making predictions. There was a lot of press around that, and just here's an article that appeared on 538. Another article from 538 talking about the differences in the models and why they disagree. And then an article from the Wall Street Journal. And if you remember then, there was a lot of discussion about should you forecast cases, should you forecast deaths? Perhaps there's a lot of asymptomatic people, and that could complicate things. So in mid-March, UT, the campus closed, and I was back at home, and I wanted to think about, well, when might we reopen? And I couldn't find any forecasts at that time. That was early on. Certainly could have missed some, but I decided to just build my own simple model and see what it might say. And then the IHME forecasts, which I think have probably been picked up the most by the press and policymakers, came out shortly thereafter. I wrote about it on LinkedIn for my colleagues there and made some forecasts, but I didn't try to participate in the CDC modeling efforts. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an infectious disease modeler. This is stuff I did, in the evening and on the weekend, and had a day job that was keeping me really busy during this time. There were a lot of changes on campus, and also my model runs in Excel and is really, really simple. There's a gentleman at UMass Amherst started collecting forecasts from different experts. And this interests me quite a bit because in decision analysis, we assess probability ranges, distributions from experts or from data, and we're always interested in how they perform. And so this piqued my interest. And this was an example display that came from 538. 538 was publishing what Dr. McAndrew was doing. And each bar here is a different forecast. The dot is the quote best estimate from the expert. And then there's a low estimate and a high estimate. And they published a consensus forecast, some kind of an average of all these different experts. And at this time, it was 386,500 cumulative deaths. And this was for a particular day. This was on April 5th. Okay. And I think this forecast came out on March 31st or April 1st. And so the consensus is we'll be at 386,500. Of course, there's a lot of variability there. Some experts' ranges don't encompass the consensus. And then I thought, well, let me just see what my model says about this. And my forecast was 339,643. And you can see where that falls relative to the experts' forecasts. The actual number of cases ended up being 333,302. So the error in the consensus was 16%. And then my error was 2%. And I was surprised by this. And this was only 5 days in advance. And when you look at some of the forecasts, some of them are quite, I think, hard to understand. We're currently at 141,000 cases at this time, and to think that we could be at some of these high estimates, 1 million cases within 5 days, it just was hard to understand what was going on there. Also, why is there so much uncertainty just a few days in advance, and how could the experts be wrong? So this piqued my interest, and I started trying to follow this a little bit more closely. So for me, again, the interesting subtext here has been modeling. Like, how can a simple model perform relative to more complicated models? As we add complexity to models, presumably the models would get more accurate, and by how much? There's many different modeling approaches, and does the structure of the modeling approach have any bearing on its accuracy? Or some approaches may be better than others. As modelers, are modelers focused on adding detail to improve accuracy, or is it about trying to mimic reality? And those could be different. And then it also just seemed to me that the models that were more complex, maybe people believed in them more, but maybe they didn't perform better. And so this is what I've tried to think about as we were going forward. Let me describe the simple model that I had constructed here. And I'm going to start with something we call an influence diagram in decision analysis, and compare it to or talk about something you might have heard of, which is a SEER model. And these ovals are uncertainties. And we are uncertain about the number of asymptomatic people out there. And I think the way people were thinking about it, there were a certain number of identified cases, and then there was the under ascertainment rate, which is, well, how many people really have it that we're missing, that aren't experiencing symptoms or haven't been tested. And if you recall, that was really a big discussion at the time, that really you can't forecast cases because you don't know how many asymptomatic people there are, and therefore we should focus on forecasting deaths because that is more observable. So we have how many people are really infected. The people that are susceptible, they're going to interact in some way. So the susceptible people and the infected people interact in some way, and we get some people that are exposed. Then there's an infection rate, and based on the number of exposures and infection rate, we could estimate the number of new cases, and I'm putting that as an octagon, meaning this is what we're interested in trying to forecast. And then if we had an estimate of fatality rate, we could forecast number of deaths and maybe number of recovered. these SEER models, they track how people move through these states. So susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. And then there's a decision here, which are policy decisions and individual decisions that have some influence on these uncertainties. So when we're socially distancing, then perhaps we're reducing the interaction rate, or we're wearing a mask or something. Maybe there's policy decisions, treatments that affect the fatality rate. Okay, so that's at a very crude and high level, and we could try to model this. We could try to break the problem down and model it at this level of detail. Or what I did is essentially drew a box around all of this complexity and said, well, let's just think about the growth in the number of cases. There's a certain number of cases currently. What's the growth rate in the number of cases? And that's going to be able to give me the new cases. All of these dynamics and interactions, I'm not modeling explicitly. And if asymptomatic people are important in the number, it'll show up in the growth rate. Okay, so this would be a very simplified model where we've abstracted away a lot of these details, not trying to model them, and just going to summarize that with a single parameter. Okay. So this is what I did early on, and you could do the same thing for deaths. It's a very simple model. Okay, so then the question is, well, what are the equations for this? The first equation would be, well, if we don't do anything, cases are going to grow exponentially. N here is the number of cases at some time period. N naught, N sub 0, that's the number of cases we're starting with at our forecasting period. And we're saying the number of cases is going to grow exponentially at some growth rate, G, over some amount of time. And again, G is really summarizing all of this complexity here. And G is the growth rate in the number of cases. So I'm starting out with cases, and then you could apply the same framework to forecasting deaths. Now, if you're an engineer, maybe you've seen things like this before. If you have exponential growth, we can just take the logarithm of both sides. And what you get is, if you plot the logarithm of the number of cases, when it's growing exponentially, you'd get a straight line, and the slope of that line would be this growth rate that we're looking for. Okay, so that's the first equation. It's going to grow exponentially if we don't do anything. Now, if you looked early on, this is data from Korea and Italy early on, which were a bit ahead of the United States, and all the data we're taking is from Johns Hopkins. You've probably seen their dashboard on the news. And so we're taking data from that, which they make available. And here what I've done is I've plotted that growth rate. I've plotted G versus the number of days since they had their 100th case. And what you noticed early on was this growth rate isn't constant. If it was constant, then it would grow exponentially and we would all get it. So because we're making personal decisions to socially distance ourselves or following policies, for whatever reason, this growth rate, it tended to start high in most of these locations, and then it would decay. And when I looked at that, it looks like maybe the growth rate itself follows some exponential growth or decay process. So instead of G being a constant, I'm going to say, well, let's let G vary with time, and it's going to decrease at some rate K. Again, if you take the logarithm of this, then if you plot the logarithm of the log growth rate, you should get a straight line. And then we can use simple regression to estimate this parameter K. So K is the key parameter here, and it's the rate at which the growth in the number of cases is changing. So it's really the second derivative that is important if this model is correct, and what we need to watch and estimate. And this is what I was trying to stress on the LinkedIn posts. Okay. So this is this is the naive, what I'm calling the naive model. First equation, cases are going to grow exponentially. Second equation, the growth rate is going to decay exponentially. And really, there's just a single parameter, k, that we need to estimate. And there's two initial conditions that we need. Okay, so I think this is sort of the simplest non-trivial model that we could think about. Now, it ends up, if you think about time being continuous, not day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. If you think about it just being continuous, you can do some calculus there, and you can show that this model results in what's known as the Gompertz function, which was developed in 1825 to model human mortality with an exponentially increasing rate of death, so which we call the force of mortality. So as we get older, we're more likely to die in any given year. Your probability of death is not constant. It's the same effect that was occurring here, that as we moved forward in time, the rate of growth was decreasing. So we call this model naive in the sense of being straightforward or lacking sophistication. Also mean it in the sense that it uses very little data, right? It doesn't know a lot about the future, doesn't know anything about the future. It just knows, well, what's been happening to the change in the rate of growth in the number of cases or in the number of deaths. So this was April 1st. This is the log of the growth rate. So this is what we need to fit in order to estimate our K parameter, and this is in the US. The growth rate was declining, looks like exponentially, because when we take the log, we get this straight line. And if we fit it, this would be our K parameter here, this 0.0653 or negative 0.0653. When you do that, then you could produce a forecast going forward for the growth rate. Essentially, we're forecasting the growth rate in the number of cases or in the number of deaths. And so this was the forecast as of March 31st. And then here's a bigger plot of how it did. So the forecast was at this red dot. The dotted line is the forecast for the growth rate. So the model was saying that the growth rate is going to continue to decline. And then the blue are the actuals. Okay, and so it looks like, wow, the actuals fall pretty nicely on top of this forecast. Here in these plots, this is total cases. The blue is what we knew at the time, back on April 1st. The gold's the forecast. And then the red dots are the actuals. So this is total cases, this is new cases. And you can see that, actually the model did pretty well. This naive model did pretty well. This was the forecast, that's this Gompertz distribution. But you can see what it can't do, which is also important. It has no knowledge of the fact that, let's say, states might reopen, policies might change, and cases might increase in July. It's saying, if things keep going, then this is where we'll be. I compared how this was doing to these consensus forecasts from UMass, and again, was just surprised that how well a simple model could do. Many times the error, 7 out of these 9 weeks, the error from this just simple naive model was less than the error from the consensus of the expert forecasts. Now, one challenge is we have to fit this model. We have to estimate this change in the growth rate. And that's over what time period we fit it is subjective. As policies change, the growth rate's going to change. And what I was doing was essentially looking at a 3-week window, sliding 3-week window, and fitting this simple model as we go forward. And so this is what it would have looked like early on, and this is what it looks like July 31st through the 20th. Okay, so it was a steep decline here early on. It's declining now, but still, but not at the same rate. I think there are more sophisticated approaches here, so perhaps a Bayesian approach, which would be even more effective than what we're doing here. Okay, but we're going to use a 3-week sliding window to fit the model, except when we go to deaths, we make a slight change to that. All right, let me talk just some other models. And again, we really pulled these to just illustrate different modeling approaches. There's MIT has a model called Delphi, and it's one of these SEER models. So it breaks down this system in more detail than the naive model. And it takes into account under ascertainment the number of perhaps the cases that we're missing, and it takes government policies into account. They provide daily forecasts on cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. It has 9 parameters, okay, compared to our 1, 2 initial conditions and some constants such as the rate of detection, what's the incubation time, and so forth. It also includes a model for government response, and it includes 4 different phases of government response that try to modify this system. And it looks at data around the world to estimate the effectiveness of the government response. So it's much more detailed than what we're doing. Then there's another model, COVIDprojections.com by Yu Yang Gu. This is, unlike MIT, this is a team. COVID projections is a single individual, very impressive single individual that built this model. It's a SEER model, provides daily forecasts, and it forecasts deaths because, again, the idea was cases are going to be really hard to forecast and we have more information about deaths. It has 13 parameters and 7 constants, and it's supposed to use machine learning to estimate these parameters. Another approach, maybe a top-down approach, would be to presume that instead of this Gompertz distribution, there's some other functional form that the number of cumulative cases is going to follow. We don't really model the system explicitly, but we say that the result of this system is going to follow a particular curve, and I would call that a curve fitting model. And early on, this is my understanding of what the IHME model was trying to do. This is probably the most famous model. It used data on deaths, hospitalizations, and then later, I believe, cell phone data to forecast deaths and hospitalizations on a weekly basis. And so originally they were using a curve fit to an assumed distribution. And then they more recently have added a SEER model, and now they're taking an average in some way of these two models. Okay. Another model, I think, in this spirit is a model at the University of Texas. I'm not involved with this model, but it's uses currently a hybrid approach of a curve fitting type of model, which I think was supposed to be an improvement on IHME, and they use mobility data. And then they also have a SEER model, and again, taking some kind of an ensemble or an average of these 2 different approaches. So the approach of these 2 teams has changed, I think, a little bit with time. And then another model we look at is from Los Alamos National Labs. It's, I think, what I'd call a time series model, and I'd also call our naive model a time series model. It tries to forecast the growth rate and the number of cases, which is what we do as well. It forecasts cases and deaths twice a week. Their model is very interesting. They produce a full range of uncertainty, full uncertainty distribution. And we'll have a little bit to say about that. So I tried to put some structure to this. That you can debate me if this is the right structure, but I was trying to think about from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. Top-down approach, I think, is a curve-fitting approach. We don't model the system explicitly. The emergent behavior of the system is summarized with some assumed functional form. And I think the first IHME and UTexas models would fit into that category. Then there's a time series approach where we model the system at a high level. There's a few equations which summarize the dynamics of the system, and we have to estimate macro level parameters. I think the Lano model and then the naive model is in this category. And then there's a SEER approach, which you're breaking down the system into some components. Of course, when you break the system down into more components like susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, you have to then estimate parameters, which specifies how individuals move between these groups. I think that's the MIT YYG and then the newer IHME and UTexas approach. And then there's something called agent-based modeling, where we would model individuals and model how these individuals interact with people. And there'd be simple rules for specifying how they interact. And any kind of system level effects would be emergent from these simple rules. And Notre Dame takes this approach. We haven't analyzed the accuracy of the Notre Dame model, but others have. YYG has a nice summary of the accuracy of different models. Okay, so I think we're kind of adding detail. We're breaking the system down into more components as we go down this. Okay, so in terms of accuracy, what we've done is we've scored the models based on their error in forecasting additional cumulative cases or deaths over some time interval. So, for example, suppose it's day 0 and we currently have 100,000 cumulative cases. And then on day 10, we estimate that we're going to be at 140,000 additional cumulative cases. So that's 40,000 additional cases is what we're forecasting. And then we actually got 70,000 additional cases to be up at 170,000. So we're saying that, well, the error would be 40,000 is what we forecast, 70,000 is what we got, divided by 70,000. We underestimated by 43%. Okay. And then we're going to look at the absolute error. So we take the absolute value of this. So if you're above or below, you're getting equally penalized. So instead of being, if you're 10% above and 10% below on average at 0, we'd say, well, that's still 10% error. But we're looking at the error in the additional cases forecast. Here's an example to make sure we're clear. This is July 10th forecast for deaths. And the models don't always forecast on that exact date. So just picking the closest, IHME on July 7th, they were forecasting 7,470 additional deaths by July 17th. We actually observed 8,810. So that's a negative 15% error they were under. LANL and so forth. And you can see the different error metrics, error measures here. And so this naive -3, that means we're fitting it over the previous 3 weeks, was 11% error, underestimation. And then we can go out further out to July 24th, and we should see the errors increase as we go further out in time. And that's just an example of how it works. For most comparisons, we're going to look at a forecast 28 days ahead. The CDC is publishing forecasts 28 days ahead. Some models don't go out really much further than that, but here's the different models we're looking at and how far out they forecast. Here, I'm just going to present the error 28 days out. We have looked further out as well. Okay, so let's look at the accuracy in the number of cases. This is the mean absolute percent error from 0 up to 50%. And then this is the number of days ahead. The red model is the MIT model. The blue model is LANL's Los Alamos model. And then the green model is this naive model fit to the previous 3 weeks of data. And you can see that the naive model does relatively well. And you can also see as you go out in time, it gets more difficult to forecast. So 4 weeks out, the average error is approaching 40%. Okay. Near term, maybe the errors are around 10%. Okay. This is how it performed in different months. This is April. Naive model did relatively well. May had some difficulty with the longer term forecast in May, and the LANL model did well there. June and then in July, and you can see that the errors for all the models have ramped up in July as things really changed. And these are forecasts for the entire United States, I should have said. So as things were really changing rapidly, all the models had a difficult time keeping up with that. But the naive model seems to be able to do well in terms of its error and forecasting cases. Not all the models forecast cases, so that's why we just have these three. I mentioned the models also have an uncertainty interval. LANL provides a 98% probability interval, so they give an interval, and for 98% of the days, the actual should fall within that. And the dotted line is 98%, and then this blue line is how often their forecast fell within that interval, given a certain number of days ahead. And so you can see they're really close to being what we would call well calibrated. The actuals are falling within their intervals about the amount of time that it should. The naive model did well near term, pretty well calibrated near term, but long term, its probability intervals aren't as well calibrated. And so, 28 days out, we were saying there's a 90% chance the cases will be in this interval, but they were only in the interval 40% of the time. All right, now let's look at forecasting deaths. And one problem that for cases, but it's more pronounced for deaths, is that there's reporting issues and delays. If you look at over the last 4 months, what fraction of the deaths have been reported on different days, you should get about 14% of the deaths occur on any given day. That'd be 1/7. But there's about half of that on Sundays, a little bit more on Mondays, and then there's a big peak on Wednesdays. So there appear to be some reporting issues. And George Van Eef and Peter Bastian I've traded emails with them, Colin and I, and they've helped us think through this a little bit. This ends up being really important because if we don't correct the reporting error, it has a big effect on our ability to do this regression. So here's deaths, and then here's the growth rate, the log of the growth rate that we're estimating. And all these low points are Mondays and Sundays, and then these are the rest of the days of the week. So what we do is we take a 7-day average. So instead of taking the number of deaths reported on a given day, we take that day and average it with the previous 6 days. So to smooth out, instead of using this data, we've smoothed it out and used this in terms of the growth rate. When we do that, we're using the prior week. So then we said, well, we shouldn't really be using 3 weeks of data. We're already using the first week for the average. So now we're just going to fit the model to the previous 2 weeks because we're taking this 1 week average. And then here's how the models perform. This is the mean absolute percent error, number of days ahead for the different models. There's a lot of error early on because of this reporting issue. So unless you're going to try to adjust the forecast for on Sundays and Mondays and Wednesdays, which we don't try to do, you're going to get a fair amount of error early on. And then you can see what the errors in the long-term forecasts for the different models. And again, this naive model does very well in terms of its error, and this is April 1st through August 4th. This is the performance by month. Again, April, May, June, and July. And again, you can see that the green line is doing relatively well, which again, I think is surprising given its simplicity, one parameter. Here we're just we're taking the average of the errors in a given month just to see where the model's ranked. And the naive model is performed relatively worse in July than some of these other models. It's harder for it to keep up or use any type of forward-looking data, so that's probably one reason why its performance hasn't been as good in May, but it's still in the pack here. right? And this is a model that you could build right at home and run in Excel. This is a look at these probability intervals and how well calibrated the models are. So again, Lanel's giving a 98% probability interval. 96% of the time, the actuals fall within that. The naive model, we gave a 90% interval. 82% of the time, we fall within that. So it's not as well calibrated as the Lanel model. And Lanel is pretty impressive, but it's not too bad. Okay. All right, so in terms of conclusion here, and then we can take some questions. This is the forecast as of August 22nd from the naive model, and it's forecasting 197,000 cumulative deaths by the week ending September 12th, or a range of P95, 5 percentile, P95, 95th percentile of 210,000. You can compare that to what I showed you earlier. The national ensemble that CDC is projecting is saying between 187,000 and 205,000. And then this really simple model says, well, they'll be between 189 and 210,000. And just you can see the gold line is the mean forecast, and then these are the probability intervals around that for cumulative cases, and then for new cases, okay, and new deaths. There's a lot of uncertainty trying to, if you want to try to forecast deaths on a given day because of this reporting issue. If you wanted to forecast just average deaths over the last 7 days, the interval would be much narrower. But because of just this way the deaths get reported, you get a lot of variability on a weekly basis. Okay, so my takeaways. First one, prediction's hard, especially about the future. That's a famous quote from Niels Bohr, or maybe it was Yogi Berra. Some of the models are more detailed because they include parameters that could be changed through policy decisions. For example, we want to know if we have people wear masks, what impact might that have? Perhaps the naive model could be tuned in that way to include mobility data and policy information data. I think that is interesting. I think just from a modeling perspective, right, and a decision support perspective, I think we need to think carefully about adding detail to models. Adding detail may lessen accuracy, it may not increase accuracy. And then I often warn students about building Humpty Dumpty models. So, and by that I mean, if we break a model up into many pieces because we want to add some fidelity, that's great, but we have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And sometimes that's pretty difficult to think about how all the different parameters are interacting and making sure that we capture them. Whereas this naive approach, it summarizes all those effects in a single growth rate. It's not trying to track, for example, or estimate the number of asymptomatic people. To the extent that that's important, that'll show up in the growth rate itself. And we use this kind of approach in other settings. Commodity price forecasting would be a common one. If you wanted to forecast the price of oil, you could build a very detailed supply-demand model for the Earth and all the different places that oil is produced, all the different wells. We could model their production profiles, and we could estimate production, and then we could build a very detailed demand model. And then we could solve for some equilibrium and when the market's going to clear, and we would estimate the price of oil. That would be very challenging. Another approach, which we tend to take, I would say, in decision analysis, would be to simply model the dynamics of the oil price itself. The reason oil price moves around is because of all these supply-demand effects. And instead of trying to break that down into a lot of pieces, which you really can't ever put back together very well, let's just build a time series model essentially on that variable. Okay, so I think Canavis, why don't I pause there and then see what questions you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for that opportunity.
Hey, Canevas, I'm not hearing your audio.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah, I turned my video off. But
Okay. So here's the first question. Do any of the model attempts to create individual models for each state or geographical subset and then combine those to create an overall? It just seems like different areas of the country are at different stages in the COVID life cycle and could be distorting results when lumped together.
right,
As in New York, growth rate was falling, Texas and other southern states were increasing.
right. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me tell you what we did, and I didn't mention this, but we've modeled it at the national level, at the state level, and then some metropolitan areas like Houston, for example, or Austin. And so we are not summing models from many different regions to come up with the national forecast. It's on the national data directly. I believe the other groups are doing a similar thing, but I am not 100% certain about that. I think it'd be fascinating to compare those different approaches as you model at the aggregate geographic area versus some smaller spatial dimension, and comparing those results, I think would be very interesting.
All right. Luis Mendoza, question is, JHU recently released charts on the impact of opening and closing decisions state by state. Have you looked back on the accuracy of the NIVE model as these policy changes take effect?
We've only looked at it in aggregate and then by month, not tried to link it to particular policy decisions that were made, but I think that's a nice idea.
Okay. Next question from Brian. This is great information, he says, so thank you, Brian. How do you think about measurement error in the model building? The true number of cases is dependent on testing and testing accuracy. And some of the historic data has been corrected recently once error is discovered.
Yeah, so again, these are really good questions. So in terms of testing and availability of testing, and then the degree to how severe the symptoms are of people that are being tested, this naive model doesn't take any of that into account. And it simply summarizes all of that with a growth rate in the number of cases or a growth rate in the fatality rate. So it doesn't try to build that in. In terms of model error, when we produce a probability interval on our forecast, like I showed you at the end, that's conditional on this model being correct in some way. And we're just showing the error in estimating the parameters of this model. And I think that explains why, at least in cases, it doesn't do as well. Our model's not that well calibrated in the longer term here, because we're assuming essentially the model's right and it's only the parameters. And if we built in some uncertainty about whether we have the right model or not, I think these intervals would be wider and maybe more accurate.
Okay, great. The next question is from Hank Jones. Has analysts and modeling of COVID modeling been inhibited or delayed at all by any analyst claiming intellectual property rights or barriers in their data analysis or softwares anywhere? If so, where, who, and why? Thanks.
I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of anyone trying to withhold anything. I would say it is hard to figure out how everyone's doing their modeling. There are, they have websites and they explain their models, and some make their code available via GitHub. So I actually think it's been very transparent, but it is it is hard. It takes some effort to really try to understand what each of the different groups are doing. So I'd say my uncertainty about it, what they're doing, is more a function of how much time I've been able to allocate to this right now, and not anything nefarious on their part.
Great. Yeah, it's hard to kind of capture all of that. Okay, and the next question comes from Heather. Do any of the models take into account the lag in cases reported from time when infected? For example, holidays that people gather, such as Memorial Day or July 4th, cause a spike in cases, but it takes a certain time frame to receive the reported cases. Is that factor included in any of the models, or is it simple assumption made for average time it takes to receive the results?
So for our model, we don't take that into account explicitly. It's implicitly in the dynamics of the growth in cases. So we have it, but not in an explicit way. The other models, again, that's a detail. I don't know exactly how they handle it, but I know that several of the models have single constants or assumptions for example, the incubation time, and don't treat that in an uncertain way. And I think their argument for some of these constants, like incubation time or rate of detection, is that our understanding about those is better, and so they're just treating those deterministically.
Okay. And I think this is going to be the last question. This comes from James Pappas. I did the exact same thing Eric did with his naive model nationally for Texas, as well as selected counties. Has he given any thought to adding a wildcat term to account for the results from changes in policy, culture effects, etc.? Opening business, curfews, higher obesity, diabetes rates, weekend effects, etc.
Okay, yeah, thank you, James. So, and that's interesting because essentially the ideas underlying this for me tied back a lot to forecasting production in oil wells, and we think about growth rates and plot things on log curves and so on, and so that was all something I've kind of swam in and was my ideas here, and that might have been some of James's ideas as well. And so I did this for Texas as well, but have not gone any further trying to account for any of the things that James has suggested. I think that would be interesting, and that's great work for a graduate student if Colin's on the line and listening to try to pin some of those things down.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Bickel, for your excellent presentation and the thorough details that you provided for us today. And thank you all so much for your outstanding questions. We want to formally thank each of you for joining today's webinar, and we hope the conversation was valuable. Next, we wanted to highlight a few of our professional development short courses and future webinars. As you saw in today's presentation, good leadership is always needed in tackling some of the world's biggest challenges. We at Texas Engineering Executive Education have carefully created a certificate program that pinpoints tools and methodologies to tackling leadership challenges for STEM professionals. And here are some upcoming classes and dates. If you would like to learn more, and please visit our website or check out our YouTube page for the webinar discussion. Also, we wanted to quickly highlight the upcoming energy-related courses with petroleum fundamentals and petroleum measurements. If you or your organization need additional training in this area, please contact our PTEX department today. We also want to thank the 3 units of the Cockrell School of Engineering that helped put this wonderful program together. First is the Texas Engineering Executive Education, who works to reskill and upskill companies' current workforce, either through our master's degree programs, graduate certificates, or short courses. So if you have a need around STEM education or training, make sure to contact our department to learn more. Next is the Petroleum Extension of Texas, or PTEX. This department has been around for over 75 years, serving the oil and gas professionals, either through e-learning, publications, and online and in-person training. We would have the training to meet your oil and gas needs. And last but not least is our research relations team. This team partners with industry to solve some of the world's biggest challenges in energy, water, transportation, wireless communications, and many more. The Office of Research Relations works to facilitate and derive high value from research collaborations between companies and UT's researchers. So email the Research Relations Office to initiate a discovery discussion. All three units are here to serve you and your company through education, training, and research. So feel free to contact us at any time, and we would love to collaborate on helping you reach your company's full potential. As we continue in the Text Talk series, I wanted to make sure you're aware of our upcoming webinar. On September 25th, Professor D.K. Ezekoye will be discussing lithium-ion battery safety. This webinar will address the challenges associated with fire protection, inspection, and investigation of modern battery systems. You know, with everyone's dependence on cell phones and the desire to extend battery life, I know that this was going to be an exciting conversation. So we hope you join us and mark your calendars today. If you would like to provide feedback on today's webinar or suggestions for future topics that may interest you, please include them in today's survey following the presentation. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a great weekend and hook 'em horns.